The Midnight Selkie, Chapter 1. Came the small, groggy whine of a small boy. The sloshy noise was enough to waken him, and even enough to start lifting a bit of nausea from the pit of his stomach. Truth be told, the gentle rocking didn't help either. Slowly, his eyes opened, and the world started to become clear. He felt sticky and even a little dry. It almost felt as if he were covered in dry salt water? Indeed, he realized swiftly then that he had fallen asleep on an inflated raft, bouncing on gentle waves in the center of the sea. "How did I get out here?" he cried out. He had no memory of being on a boat. This would be completely unlike him. He didn't even like the beach. How could something like this be so? Looking around, there was nothing to indicate how he had come to be in such a predicament. There was nothing but bright skies and endless deserts of water. It took several minutes before any sort of movement other than the water could be seen. In this waste, perception was lost to him, so telling distance was impossible. But the dots in the distance could be just as well for him. After all, he was starting to get hot and sweaty, which only made him itch. "Hey!" he called, cupping one side of his mouth and waving his other arm frantically over his head. "Hey, I'm over here!" It did no good to call to the spots in such a manner. No response came by way of any sort of sounds. But the dots bobbed, vanishing and reappearing as they came closer. The boy realized that these spots were not boats or any sort of real valid rescue, but perhaps just a pod of dolphins. It was not ideal, for he wasn't sure just what sort of good dolphins would do. He wasn't much of a flipper fan, after all, but he had heard tales of dolphins saving people from the sea. Though tempting, he still wasn't sure this was quite the time to test such a theory. If dolphins were in these waters, he was sure there were other creatures as well. Of those creatures, he did not want to fathom the notion of acknowledging them. There would be no happy little mermaids out here to save him. Sure enough, as the dots came closer, they were indeed a pod of smiling and laughing dolphins. As were their nature, they came alongside the little boat and examined it, spy-hopping to get a notion for the strange thing inside the boat. It was one of those human things. It wasn't anything they could eat, but perhaps it was something they could play with. Truth be told, the oceans of the world were vast, with many open waters, with nothing for miles. Creatures like this would provide new and stimulating entertainment in such nothingness. This, however, would prove much against the boy's favor. Simultaneously, the dolphins began to poke and prod at the boat, much to the boy's displeasure. He pleaded and scolded the creatures. How could they be so rude? Yet still they continued, causing the occupant to swing his hands into the water, smacking a few on the head. Only a moment of silence passed before the dolphins returned and were able to tip the boat. The boy screamed once he resurfaced. He hated to be in the water, and this was the worst-case scenario for him. For his size, returning the boat would be a feat far too great for him. On the bright side, the inside of the boat would prove a nice shield from the growing hot sun. However, legs in the water, it was only a matter of time before things came up to investigate. It wasn't long. In fact, shortly after the toppling of the boat, the dolphins decided that this creature was of no entertainment value, so they left him. When he felt something swim past his legs, he could only hope that perhaps they had returned. Cautiously, he ducked out from under the boat to look at his surroundings. It certainly couldn't have been any worse. And if he wasn't mistaken, they were dotted with white tips. Sharks! Where the dolphins had been were now sharks sizing him up. In the next instant, he felt a pull, then another. He let out screams, even though it was unlikely anyone would ever hear his calls of distress. Another tug pulled him underwater, and face to face with oncoming, gaping jaws. A gasp escaped, Heavy panting followed it. The boy's eyes shot open to find that he was not in the boat, or even at sea. He was safe in his bed, in a cold sweat. And wet. "Oh," he whined, realizing where he was and the reality of the situation. "Shit!" He was Raleigh Stock, and he was 10. Incidents like that were not uncommon to him. The bedwetting, however, was starting to become a real nuisance. It had started when he was 3, and had simply continued as he grew. No amounts of treatments or counseling seemed to be able to break him of the habit. It really was only able to fuel on serious issues with him. He hated water. Baths were one thing. Rain was another. These things were okay. But when it came to pools, lakes, beaches, and so forth, those were other matters entirely. Raleigh's aquaphobia was so far rooted in his psyche that it simply cut him off from being what one would call normal. It was a pity, really. Raleigh was a rather dashing little boy. Sandy blonde hair covered his head like a well-trimmed bush. He was tall, but rather lanky, bringing to mind a spindly cartoon character. Perhaps when it came down to it, though he could stand taller than his classmates, he could still be deemed smaller for his lack of mass. Downstairs, things progressed as normal. Raleigh's father, Dr. Malcolm Stock, was already at the table, reading his newspaper and sipping at a cup of coffee. His mother, Kiana Stock, was busy with the rest of the breakfast items. Though her husband seemed oblivious to her, she went on as though it were the most wonderful day in the world. She hummed a happy little tune. If sunshine could be embodied, she would likely be so. She seemed like a fairy tale sort of person, much in contrast to Malcolm, who was very down to earth and serious. "Morning, Mom," Raleigh said as he sat himself down at the kitchen table. He considered his father for a few moments. He could have offered a good morning to him as well. But what difference would it have made? He was too engrossed in his paper to care, or even notice. "Sleep well?" Kiana asked him, as she scooped the scrambled eggs onto her spatula. "You're up rather early. I would have thought you'd sleep in a little longer." "I had another accident," he frowned, lowering his head in shame. The rustling of the paper distracted him as his father turned the pages abruptly. "Oh, poor thing," she soothed. "Another nightmare." "Yeah." "Maybe we should just avoid giving him anything after 4:30, Malcolm suddenly suggested. "Then there won't be anything in his bladder to piss out." He turned to peer over his shoulder at his son. "Don't you think you should be outgrowing this childish phase by now?" "Malcolm!" Kiana scolded. "It's not like I want to wet the bed, Dad," Raleigh insisted. "Then don't." "Malcolm, stop it," Kiana insisted. "We don't need this sort of environment. It's not good for anybody." "Never mind," Raleigh sighed. "I'm not hungry." And with that, he got back up and trudged from the room. Kiana began to go after him, only to stop and glare at her husband. "Was that really necessary, Malcolm?" "He needs to grow up, Kiana," he replied. "Coddling him won't make him do that." "I'm not coddling him," she insisted. She immediately set to taking a washcloth and wiping up the imaginary spots on the table. "I'm trying to be a supportive mother. It would be more to his benefit if his father supported him. I'm not going to support infantile behavior from a preteen boy. You're treating him like a baby, so he continues to act that way. He'll never be a productive man that way." "It's not me," she hissed. "The therapist said—" "The therapist," he mocked sarcastically. "That man is a real quack. Real doctors say there is nothing wrong with him." "It's psychological, Malcolm." "You're fueling this childish imagination of his. Psychology is like believing in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. It's just manipulating overactive imaginations." "He has trauma that he's dealing with. Trauma that you and that therapist are enabling." Kiana huffed and swung around to turn her attention on the dishes. He'll never get better if you act like that towards him." I was supportive, Kiana. Malcolm suddenly defended himself. "When we went to the therapist and he said that it would be better for him to get away from the beach, I agreed. I put out extra money to get a place out here in the mountains for him to recover. I've put up with that nonsense for almost a year. What do you have to show me that it did any good? He's still suffering from nightmares and still wetting the bed, so separating him from his hometown obviously wasn't the answer. Don't you think so?" Malcolm stood up and placed his mug in the sink. "Look, you're a mom. Moms are like that. And he's an only child. I can understand how you'd want to just keep mothering him. But he can't stay a baby forever." "I don't want him to. But what can we do?" "Stop enabling him. That thing happened 7 years ago. He barely remembers it, I'm sure. All he knows is that the water is a scary place, and can't explain why. It's illogical. If you want a psychological explanation, I'll give you one. You're feeling guilty about what happened back then. It is projecting on him. Because you are not over it, he'll never get over it." He glanced at his watch and kissed her cheek. "I gotta go. I need to pick up a few things in town." "Okay," she whispered, letting him leave without a glance from her. She bit and sucked on her lip, turning to face the direction he had been in once he had already departed. She knew what happened that day, 7 years ago. It was a beautiful day in the marina. In the distance, the ebb and flow of the waves rolling onto the beach lulled like a soft lullaby to any who could hear. On a small boat, Kiana stood in a light blue sundress and a white sun hat with a ribbon. She had to hold it a moment as the breeze whisked by. That was part of the beauty on a hot day like this, on a beach town. That was part of the beauty on a hot day like this on a beach town. It was always cooler near the water. Captain Jim W. Morris handed the 3-year-old child up to her before he followed. Malcolm was always busy at work. One would think, being a marine biologist, they'd be out as a family on boats quite often. This was not so. He seemed far too interested in working in the lab. So, Kiana was left exploring the wonderful waters with her father on his boat, the Aquaquami. It was an interesting name. It meant the Saturday waters. What began as a weekend hobby had become a career of sorts. Captain Jim ran a whale and dolphin watching business off the marina. There was no shortage of business during the warmer months. Even in the cooler months, fanatics were eager to get a glimpse of the creatures this place had to offer. Even with no dolphins or whales, there was never a shortage of seals or sea lions. Kiana grew up with such pleasures, and she was eager to raise her precious son in the ways of the water in hopes of him taking after her family's adoration, or that of his father. At first, Raleigh was rather excited about this sort of thing, but that day he would change dramatically. Deep out to sea they went, enjoying more so just the feel of the freedom on the salty world. Finding a nice spot to stop, the boat was allowed to bob freely as a quilt was set down on the deck. It was the perfect place for a little nautical picnic. Above were the melodious cries of scavenging seagulls. No true mariner could call themselves such if these pesky birds did not bring a sense of comfort. Comfort is lost when a parent blinks. It only takes a second, some parents say, for a child to get themselves into serious trouble. It felt like only a second had gone by, and that the result lasted an eternity. Kiana had turned her head for only a moment, calling absently, "Raleigh, would you like something else to eat?" She received no answer. "Raleigh?" She called again, as she and Captain Jim raised their gaze to search for the boy. He was standing at the bow of the boat, leaning over the front as he held onto the bars. "Raleigh!" In the next instant, both adults flew forward as the tiny hand slipped free of the bars. Down the little boy went in a fall that seemed to last forever. A hard splash came as he made contact with the water. Kiana and Captain Jim flew to the rails and searched frantically. "Raleigh!" Where is he? Captain Jim spat, more to no one in particular. He wasn't about to jump in blindly, though instinct would have made him do so. It took a few moments for Raleigh to resurface, flailing and splashing. He sputtered for air, and it was all that he needed. Captain Jim began to quickly pull off his coat and throw his hat aside before diving in, just as Raleigh went under again. Down he went after him, just short, with the boy just beyond reach on his way down. Captain Jim only had so much air, being an old man, and was forced to the surface. "Dad, where's Raleigh? Where's my baby?" Kiana called from the boat. Beneath the water, Raleigh continued to sink, eyes wide open, seemingly in a suspended state. He could hear a muffled sound, almost like an underwater song. A white blur swam past him, then circled about him again. He looked, seeing a strange figure swimming about him, inspecting him curiously. When it came closer, he could see it was a snowy white seal. It came close, his little white snout touching Raleigh's nose and cocking his fuzzy head. As if by some unspoken instinct, Raleigh wrapped his arms about the neck of the seal. He didn't seem to mind this strange contact, but instead responded positively. He did just what was needed of him, taking the boy to the surface where he let out a long breath and watery coughs. "Dad, look!" Kiana called, seeing her baby and the seal. Captain Jim turned, seeing Raleigh floating atop the seal as if it were a flotation device. "It can't be," he whispered. Casually, the seal swam closer to the boat. Utter disbelief sat on the faces of the elders. The seal came right to Captain Jim's fingertips, his little whiskers tickling against the flesh. He hesitated before finally grabbing the boy from the seal and holding him close. The seal seemed quite satisfied with this, and flung himself backwards to swim back off into the mysterious deep. It took another moment before Captain Jim snapped out of his trance and came back into reality. "Kiana! Lower the ladder! He's all right!" "What was that?" Kiana whispered as she lowered the ladder. Somehow she felt a sense of déjà vu. But she had no time to really consider the matter logically. What really mattered was that she had her baby back, and he was alive and well.